Hello, my name is Benji and welcome to Dice vs Cards. Today we visit once again Arkham Horror the card game. Last week we brought you the first part of our analysis of the investigators with yellow borders. And here we are with the continuation. This week's episode is going to focus on the 4th to 6th Seekers released. Ursula Downs, Joe Diamond and Mandy Thompson. To start with then, Ursula Downs, the Forgotten Age Cycle's chosen seeker and an explorer of note, as befits the theme of the set. What do I love about Ms Downs? Well, the fact that it's made so overtly clear just looking at her cards and stats what she's good at. Being swift and mobile and gathering clues in the process. Sweet, I can make that work. Said stat line starts with the, at this point, predictable 3 willpower. The very definition of not great but not bad. Exposing you to a little bit of pain from the encounter deck but not too much. And with her being an all-rounder in terms of health and sanity, you won't be too concerned in this area, even with the horror received by her weakness, which we'll come on to. Her intellect is the minimum you'd expect from a seeker, but we need to get her to that sweet spot of 5 ASAP to raise her efficiency. Do I need to mention the 1 in combat? Why not make it 0 while you're at it? To be fair, would you punch a swarm of rats when you could just leg it from them? Thankfully, her agility more than makes up for this shortfall. Evading at a base of 4 skill is going to see you comfortably dealing with non-hunter enemies. I must say I much prefer when one of combat or agility is a great deal higher than the other. It's just a much more efficient use of stats. Her signature ability tees you up for keeping on the move at all times. And because the free action can be any type of investigate ability found on cards, not just a basic investigate action, you can already see how you'll want to build around her signature ability and her agility. You can also see that she wants her turn to be move, then gobble up all the clues in a location, ready for the next turn to do it all again. Ursula's signature card may be a loyal companion, but loyal can sometimes be boring, and this is the definition of an average card. Especially when it takes up the sought after ally slot. A decent amount of soak, although I'd prefer it to have been horror as you'll understand in a mo, and a synergistic passive ability that it's hard not to be fond of, but a card drawing mechanic that's just a little bit too lightweight and drip fed. Not to mention bad if you draw it late. Jake's fine, just not a great deal to write home about. Her weakness though, Call of the Unknown, is not at all cricket, and a real thorn in your side. Mainly because there's no permanent way to deal with it. Yes, you can ride the wave for a turn or two, because in a perverse way, this is again synergising with your game plan, but at some point you're probably going to have to tank the 2 horror, and then it's a waiting game as to when you draw it again. If you don't find you are happy to pay the piper, but if you draw this 2 or even 3 times, that's going to be an issue. And I'm afraid the bad news doesn't stop there. Her deck building options are severely limited to neutral cards, which everyone bloody has, and relics. Okay, I bet there's some sweet ass relics in the game by now. Yeah, Ancient Stone is the first one I came across when doing a search, but she can take that anyway because it has a yellow border. To be fair, there are some like Gold Pocket Watch and Grotesque Statue, but these are all higher level cards. Where's my toolkit straight out of the box? This is definitely the aspect of this investigator that concerns me the most. With all that said though, much like the Guardian class that we've already covered, the Forgotten Age is where we started to see a little bit of variety in the design space for investigators. That's not to say that Ursula is particularly nuanced, a case of move, clue, evade, repeat, move, clue, evade, repeat is the order of the day. But it's nice to see a seeker that has a game plan that can get her through a number of scenarios solo. Warranting a maybe slightly generous B if you're getting to the table on your own, and that independence translates to multiplayer with another B. Yes, she can be left to do a busy Bumblebee impression and doesn't need a chaperone or too much helping out, but in the context of other seekers available, there are those that are more attuned to multiplayer. Next up is Joe Diamond, the private gun-toting dick that's a seeker. Interesting. Very interesting, and comes suited and booted with some competence in combat as well. Is this a Guardian Seeker in disguise? That's not all that's interesting though, as you get to build a deck within a deck when you opt to Mr. Diamond. Hear ye deck builders, your king hath arrived. So to his stat line, putting aside its symmetrical nature, which I love, we have a Seeker that can punch face. Sadly, he's not as adept at putting his willpower to the test, and this exposure to the encounter deck and other mental nasties is not ideal, especially with his relatively but not crucially low sanity. But let's move to the positive. We've already espoused what you need to do with a Seeker that comes with 4 intellect, so I shan't bother repeating it, but look at that 4 combat next to it. What does it mean to have a fight ready Seeker? I have absolutely loads of ideas. The trick will be to gain access to some plus damage items, but we'll get to that. With your high combat, you're not too fussed about the 2 agility, and you're protected somewhat from failed agility tests with his high starting health. His signature ability precipitates the need to look at this all out of order, as it refers to his deck building options, and so what the Jiminy Cricket is a hunch deck. Put simply, it's an 11 card deck you extract from your main deck during setup, that must include his weakness, which we'll come on to later, and a further 10 cards with the Insight keyword. Normally I despise these kind of narrow deck building requirements, but when you factor in the top card of this hunch deck acting as an extension to your hand, then all is forgiven. Sadly, this isn't an investigator spotlight, so we've only got time to highlight a few insight cards that warrant consideration for inclusion. Working a hunch and emergency aid are fantastic cards for the discounted 0 cost, and in terms of higher level cards, No Stone Unturned and Sure Gamble bring some versatility and a little bit of chaos bag trolling into the mix. Suffice to say, you'll be valuing 2+ cost cards higher, and those that have more consistent effects as well. It's just a great ability that Joe has at his disposal. It's not just about the discounting and the pseudo hand size increase, it's the ability to reliably play cards no matter what your current resource position. His signature card is a bit of a mixed bag that tries to do too much to justify its cost, and it's two-handed to boot. Yes, it frees up space for tool assets like magnifying glass and Hawkeye folding camera, but it's still a signature card that you'd hoped for a little bit more from, especially with his deck building means to bring other weapons and damage dealers to the table. His weakness Unsolved Case is perfectly manageable and could have been a lot worse, especially as it's removed from the game when cast. Just be cautious about tapping yourself out of resources until this is dealt with. I honestly thought before I first cast my eyes on Joe's deck building options that this is where the happiness and smiles would stop. We need access to some plus damage outside of a strange solution, but thank the old gods we're given access to levels 0 to 2 Guardian cards, and so now we've got the means to do that. Having access to 45 automatic and either Machete or Enchanted Blade, you can ensure Monsieur Diamond will have plenty of weapons at his disposal. And because of his extra deck size to accommodate this hunch deck, you'll still have plenty of flexibility in making him more punchy or more clue gathery for any given situation. So when all's said and done, Joe Diamond is an investigator that has a hell of a lot going for him. Acting as much like a brawler as he is a seeker, this was the first of his kind to be printed with some real solo chops, warranting an A for solo play. At this point I feel it appropriate to point out that these marks don't necessarily reference power level, but more viability. In other words, how able is this investigator within the confines and card pool of his class at a particular role? So with that said, because he's a good not great brawler, and because he's a good not great clue gatherer, he's going to receive the mark of a B for multiplayer. At this point, much like the other classes in this stage of the game's design cycle, investigators were really starting to mix things up, and the game was and is much better for it. Finally for today we take a look at Mandy Thompson, a researcher, an assistant, a scholar. On the surface, when you look at those words and her stat line, it looks very much like a prototypical seeker. But look a little bit deeper, and actually what we have here is an almost experimental design, a brewer's delight, and a very good friend to a party that wants to build around her talents. So to her stat line, an average 3 willpower, very much what you want to see at a minimum, so long as huge sacrifices aren't made elsewhere. And if you couple that with her high sanity, you shouldn't be sweating too much on the encounter deck. But then she hits her stride, becoming the second Seeker printed with a base 5 intellect. We're already where we want to be to get our clue gathering on, at least on standard difficulty. And as I think I've mentioned already at least once in this here video, give me either a respectable combat or agility. And so the solid academic that Miss Thompson is, she would rather fight with pen than with sword. Just don't even try to play chicken with a big ugly. Instead, use her commendable agility to press the evade button. Put it this way, I'd rather have this stat line than Daisy Walker's similar but with 2 and 2 combat agility. Her signature ability is what sets her apart though. Search cards can often be quite hit and miss and resulting in a risky proposition going all in with anything but the best versions of them. Clearly you'd rather take more of something than searching more for something. And I'll pause for a moment whilst that poorly worded sentence sinks in. But either way, this is an ability that really needs to be built around, and because of its wording, not just by you. Any investigator can take advantage of it, so all of a sudden, all those in the party will come to value search cards somewhat higher. Cards like Prepared for the Worst and Arcane Initiate work well for teammates, and Eureka is absolutely golden for Mandy. Don't get me wrong, you can get too sucked into this way of deck building. There are ultimately only so many components of a deck that you need to spend an action to fetch up, but it's certainly interesting to consider the possibilities. Her signature card, Occult Evidence, I'm completely lukewarm about. So to draw it, you need to reveal it during a search, and then you get a free clue. Great, everybody loves free clues. Seekers less so though, because they're normally pretty good at getting them the conventional way. But it loses me when I realise I have to use an action to get it back in my deck. At which point I think, what can I spend a wild icon on? I don't know, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this card whatsoever, it just doesn't do enough to make it noteworthy. Her weakness, Shocking Discovery, is nasty, with its only saving grace being that it's one and done. Losing tempo when you're searching and drawing an encounter card mid-turn is just not my idea of fun. Her 3 willpower will tide her over, but if you're drawing an enemy, no one's happy in that scenario. Thankfully, once you take your medicine, you won't see this card again, but it can still be a highly impactful and detrimental weakness to deal with. Mandy's deck building options are certainly plentiful. Not only can you choose a 30, 40 or 50 card deck with a correlating number of signature cards inserted, but you can also pick one of the other classes excluding Guardians and take 10 up to level 1 events and skills from the chosen class. Now is that better than having access to all cards including assets of a different class? I'm not sure. I think your overall deck construction often has a similar breakdown when it comes time to select your off-class cards, so it's probably a bit of swings and roundabouts. One thing I will say is that it makes her a little bit more flexible and a little bit more able to fill in gaps and weaknesses at all 4 player counts. And one thing of note with regards to deck size, now I'm a massive believer in less is more in deck construction games as it increases consistency. But what I will say is if you're going to really try and abuse her signature ability, you can afford to go up to 40. If you're only giving it a cursory acknowledgement, then best to stick to tried and tested and go with 30. That there is Mandy Thompson in a nutshell. A delightful investigator that takes a little bit more research, if you will, to make the most of her. But even with the best will in the world, it's tough to give her more than a C in a solo environment. Even with access to further evade cards in an off-class choice, like Rogue for example. In multiplayer though, the stars have to align with your partners, but if they do, she's a solid A when at the table with more than just your lonesome. But that's an A only when you know what you're doing and how to fully exploit her strengths. So there you have it, your choice of Seekers 4 through 6. It's been a slightly longer video for some reason, and so instead of the usual outro, this video is over.